Welcome to Seeking Alpha's CEO Interviews. Quality of leadership is a decisive factor in stock performance, so we provide in-depth interviews with the best and brightest CEOs in the public markets. We publish limited excerpts from our interviews on social media platforms and the full interviews at seekingalpha.com and in the highly rated Seeking Alpha mobile app. To find the full interviews, open seekingalpha.com or the Seeking Alpha mobile app and search for the phrase CEO Interviews, or simply type a stock ticker into the search box. Joe, welcome to the show. Welcome to Seeking Alpha. It's great to have you on. Thank you so much for taking the time and joining us.
Well, thank you, Raina. I'm glad to be here.
It's great to have you. So catch the audience up on those who may have heard of CV Sciences but don't know exactly where you play in the marketplace. Catch us up on where CV Sciences plays exactly.
Sure. So our company really consists of two very distinct operating units. The first one, I think most everyone is familiar with, is our consumer products division, which is really focused on and has been for the last 7 years, creating CBD products for the consumer market. And we have, as I mentioned, had our Plus CBD brand out in the market for at least 7 years now. In numerous channels, including for B2B and B2C. And the other very distinct and differentiating operating unit that we have is a drug development division that we have been working at since late 2016, early 2017. And the first medical indication that we're pursuing is nicotine cessation, which is a combination drug product, including synthetic nicotine and synthetic cannabidiol. And so that's also a very exciting operation at the company that is less well known, certainly, than our branded products on the CBD consumer side.
Yeah, I think it's really exciting and something I definitely want to talk more to you about today. Catch us up also on where you're coming from and how you got involved in the cannabis world to begin with.
Sure. So I joined CV Sciences back in June of 2014. So it's been nearly 7 years. I came from the biotech industry. I was working with a drug formulation company that had a novel patented polymer that we used to formulate really difficult to formulate drugs. We also used it as a coating on drug-eluting stents for various manufacturers. And we licensed the technology to very big pharmaceutical companies, including Pfizer, Merck, Wyeth, Boston Scientific, and Guidant, and others. And we eventually sold the business to DSM, at which time I exited and was really looking for something after that. And I was contacted by a recruiter for the CFO position. My initial instinct was, I'm not interested. I'm not doing that. It's just a little bit too out there for me. And a conversation that I had with my wife changed everything. She said, "Are you kidding me? You need to at least go on this interview and check it out." And the irony of her saying that is that she is a former attorney with DOJ. And so you kind of say, all right, well, if she's willing to suggest that I ought to get into this industry that looks like it's about ready to go somewhere different than where it currently is, I should go check it out. And so that's just sort of a funny story that happened at the same time. So I have to give the credit to my wife for really encouraging me to pursue the space. So, and it's been great.
That's awesome. I love an open-minded, supportive spouse, partner. I love it. Were either one of you aware or familiar with or knowledgeable more than like a passing cursory knowledge of cannabis and the different cannabinoids?
So I think both of us had a reasonable amount of knowledge with cannabis. I think CBD as a component of the plant, we had much less knowledge of. And so that was starting to emerge, certainly with the 2014 Farm Bill, but also with some of the early science that was being done by GW Pharma. And so there was some information out there, but there wasn't a whole lot because, as you know, the plant and all of its components were under prohibition, and in some ways still are, and that's been for the last 80 plus years. And so there's just not a whole bunch of information out there. And certainly back then there was much less.
So you go into that meeting and you were convinced by the kind of future that you saw for it. What was it that convinced you to come on board?
Well, first of all, it was becoming clear that attitudes and perception to cannabis generally were changing. You started to see states, in California, obviously the first to, um, uh, really remove, kind of the stigma and create a medical market. And then it started from there, where other states did the same thing. And by 2014, it was clear that where things were going, it was going slower at that point. It's sped up since then, but so I had comfort in knowing that that perception was changing, and the market was going to come with it.
So talk to us about that trajectory, because as you mentioned, you've been in it for years. CV Sciences has been in it for years. In terms of the cannabis numbers, if you liken it to like dog years, like 1 year in the cannabis industry is like 7 years in another sector, just because of how fast things are moving and innovations and the laws and everything. I'm curious how fast you may have seen kind of the FDA coming on board, especially with the Farm Bill passing. Were you more convinced of cannabis being kind of a solid player in the general marketplace, not non-THC we're talking about, so CBD and the cannabinoids that don't, get you high or don't have a psychoactive ingredient? Were you more positive on kind of the quick adoption by the government bodies when you were getting started, and how has that gone according to kind of how you predicted it would go?
Yeah, that it's a big question. It has a lot of different parts to it. So I'll try to break it down. So the first step was really, and this goes back to the 2014 Farm Bill as it relates to CBD, was to really get CBD out of the hands or out of the purview of DEA. And so the 2014 Farm Bill was really the first step, and 2018 Farm Bill was really completing that step to take CBD as a component as defined in the 2018 Farm Bill out of the purview of the DEA. So that was a big step, but it's obviously not the last step, as we all know. It then really shifted the purview over to FDA. And so I think all of us are, sort of saying, okay, we accomplished this, really big task. This one, it's hard to say, is it bigger? Is it going to happen quicker? Or is it going to take longer? And I think, so that is it, whether that's dog or human years, they're frustrating years for sure.
Yeah.
Innovation, on the other hand, is going at light speed compared to the regulatory change. And so we're watching all kinds of, and I think some people would call it craziness, but I think if you've been around long enough, you simply say, gee, it's simply innovation. And the consumers are not just curious, but they know that this is a very bioactive plant, and it's bioactive in its natural state. It's bioactive as it potentially gets reformulated based on concentration levels of whether it's minor or major cannabinoids. And so you're seeing all kinds of innovation, and some of it sounds and looks and feels a little like flavor of the month, and some of it, is clearly innovative. You see, some of the minors, and then you'll see Delta 8, for example, out there. And, I think, there are some people that may criticize that. I see it as just, the speed of innovation that, companies are really engaged in, trying to, see what consumers are interested in and what they benefit from. Really, the difference, the thing that's critical, that's going to help the industry, is for that innovation to be done safely and correctly, and making sure that it's done under the conditions that consumers expect and that they can trust. And so there's a handful of companies that can do that. unfortunately, there's a lot of companies that are engaged in innovation that are probably not doing it safely, that would put anything in the bottle, that would put anything on the label outside of the bottle that says what may or may not be inside the bottle, and that will make a claim on the packaging or on their website that will make a disease claim or, a drug claim or, and so that's where the challenge is. It's not necessarily that there are bad ingredients at concentration levels that may or may not make sense. It's just that it's being done by participants that are not helping the industry.
And because I think the regulations are allowing those bad actors to kind of play in those, not very clear lanes that I think are still prevalent in the industry. How do you think that gets figured out, or when do you think that gets figured out? How confident are you it gets figured out kind of in the near term?
Yeah, it's an interesting situation. Most of the time you hear the term, gee, it's an unlevel playing field, applied to a situation where the advantage is the bigger players. And so this one is interesting because there is, FDA inaction. It's allowed for this Wild West environment where there's perhaps 1,000 or more participants that are kind of doing whatever they want. Whereas companies like CV Sciences and others, and there's plenty of others that are, that would, be included in this group, are behaving themselves, generally following the rules and trying to do things responsibly to mainstream the plant and the components and ingredients from the plant. And so it creates this real unusual situation where there's this unlevel playing field. So how does that get corrected? I think over time, some of it is just naturally corrected by market forces. I think it's going to be difficult to compete if you're a tiny player. You may be able to have a website. It's going to be hard to finance enough product and to market it properly to be able to gain any traction. So I think that there will be contraction and consolidation in the space that will correct some of that. I think that some of the sales channels have natural barriers to entry. Whether that's, for now, it's Google's very restrictive on how you can advertise on their platform, and other e-commerce sites have similar restrictions. Certainly in the brick and mortar side of the world, especially for the bigger players, they're very selective about who they work with. And so they'll only work with companies that they can trust, that they know follow GMP, that they know have quality systems in place, that they know test their product and have supply chains that are trustworthy and that make products that they can believe in. And so that's a natural barrier to entry. That doesn't exist in all channels though. And so it's going to take some time. Certainly regulatory clarity would help a lot. And so it's a combination of, I think, all of those things: contraction, some of the retailers being involved in really helping to enforce and make sure that quality and safety are paramount. And then as soon as FDA clarity, I think, is in place, then that's a huge inflection point.
Do you ever ask your wife for advice on dealing with governing regulatory bodies?
So I get advice from my wife whether I ask for it or not. And it's usually really good. So,
I was going to say, I bet it's always very useful. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Do you feel like that's something that as CV Sciences, as a company, that you're addressing the FDA and you feel confident in terms of where that dialogue is going?
Yeah, so we're engaged with the FDA, and we've been in to see them several times. The same is true with members of Congress. We're very active directly with members, and we're very active with FDA. We have been into the FDA and have met with the FDA, and we have shared with them our science on the safety of CBD specifically. We did that work starting back in 2017 and into 2018. They were shocked that any company had done any work to demonstrate the safety of CBD when we went in and met with them. They were very encouraged about that. And the reason I bring that up is because one of the biggest sort of indications from FDA is that they are concerned about the safety of the ingredient. And they want to see more data on the safety of the ingredient. And so we knew that back 4 or 5 years ago, which is why we started our research and our science to demonstrate the safety of CBD as a supplement. And so, that kind of interaction, and we've been engaged with them since probably late 2017 and through the current period as well. So we think that's important. We have other companies in the space that believe the same way that we do, that a strong regulatory environment is going to help grow the industry. It's not going to restrict it.
Yeah, it definitely seems it's good for the good players, and it's good for the consumers to have all this, regulatory all this regulatory rigor. But I also think that it matters in terms of the clarity for the consumer and for the companies as we move along. And I would imagine, exactly as you're saying, the data and all the research that goes into it, I would imagine does a tremendous amount in terms of convincing them of the efficacy of the cannabinoids. I'm also curious, was that a decision behind naming CV Sciences, like having science as an inherent part of what you're bringing to the marketplace?
Absolutely. Yeah. We knew, and the reason we focused on science is we had a lot of our employees really came out of the dietary supplement industry, and specifically the fish oil industry. And the fish oil industry used to be, at least in my house, my mother lining up all the kids, getting our tablespoon of cod liver oil every day, and which was a horrible experience, but hopefully a huge health benefit over time. But that industry really evolved into what is the current fish oil industry that is supported by just a body of science that is massive, that over time has clearly demonstrated the health benefit of fish oil, and that it does help promote heart health, that it does help reduce triglyceridemia. And so this really, really small, sort of crude, out of a bottle cod liver oil industry turned into one of the most widely used supplements around the world, which is now a multi-billion-dollar category. And it's also a category that has 2 approved drugs that are more pure forms of fish oil, Vasipa and Lavazza. And so you just kind of say, okay, that is a model for what could be done with CBD, where a body of science that one, gets the FDA comfortable, and 2, gets consumers comfortable that, okay, this is supported by science. There's been, the pharmacological and toxicological work that needs to be done, the human clinical studies that need to be done to support telling consumers that this can be helpful for fill in the blank. And so I think the same opportunity is available for CBD and potentially some of the other minors. And potentially, Rena, I think there's going to be sort of emerging a little bit, and maybe even an overlap of the pharmaceutical lane, the recreational lane, and the consumer lane when it comes to the components of the plant and how they get formulated and how they get marketed and sold. So we're at the very beginning of this process, going back to your, is this dog years or human years? It kind of depends on the topic.
So when you say coming at it from a more pharmacological perspective, do you mean in terms of talking about it as a medicine and pointing to real world applications?
So as I mentioned, the if you think of the 3 lanes that were in place 10 or 20 years ago, there was one lane, and it was illicit. That was it. Illegal, illicit, black market. That was the lane. Well, no, then there was a medical lane as California in 1996 passed legislation to create the medical marijuana lane. And so that was sort of the existing lane at the time. GW Pharma shows up and starts research and creates a pharmaceutical lane straight through the front door of the FDA, eventually gains approval for Epidiolex. And, so that is a separate and distinct lane with separate and distinct regulations and market. So you had a pharmaceutical lane, you had a medical lane, and then with CBD, you start to see a consumer lane over time. And so then the medical marijuana lane turns into a recreational lane. And then you're starting to see medical doctors that are prescribing recreational marijuana or medical marijuana for their patients for medical indications that include pain and the effects of cancer treatment, nausea, and other indications that are difficult to treat, and especially with opioids. And so you're seeing how these lanes are starting to bleed into each other a little bit. And this isn't back alley, black market, illicit stuff. This is mainstream medical doctors that are prescribing or that are recommending some of these products that were 20 years ago illicit products to their patients because they're effective. And so the same thing you could say on the consumer side, that could potentially bleed a little bit. It's into the recreational side, depending on standards that we might be able to evaluate. And there are health standards that are used all the time to help determine and prevent adverse events. And I could talk a little bit about NOEL and LOEL, and that would probably be very interesting as it relates to this discussion. But I think there's going to be some bleeding into these lanes. We're already seeing it today. And again, we're at the very beginning of this. And then it's all, of course, compounded or complicated by FDA inaction. And so it's really being left to companies like us and other responsible companies, and then kind of counteracting what some of the bad actors are doing to create some of the imbalance. But, for example, we're destigmatizing the cannabis plant generally. I think that's one of the things that our industry is doing, and everyone, including you, Rena, are involved in this. We're looking at this completely different. Some of it is generational, but not all of it. And with a plant that was under prohibition for 80 years, you couldn't do any research. There's tons of, anecdotal. There's millions of users that anecdotally can say it helps me sleep, it helps me with pain. I don't have to take aspirin. I don't have to take anti-inflammatory drug, on and on. And so we're now just trying to understand sort of what is commonly referred to as the LOEL. And the LOEL is a standard that's used to measure, potentially negative health issues or effects that come up. It's LOEL as a lowest observed adverse event level. And so there's been plenty of research that suggests, for example, that the lowest observed adverse effect level for THC is about 2.5 milligrams per serving. So what that means is that under that threshold, you would generally not see an adverse effect. And so that's an interesting piece of science that we never knew until recently because it's been under prohibition. And so that could potentially affect what is a consumer product, what is a recreational product, and certainly how even physicians, until other drugs like Epidiolex are approved, might work with their patients to treat indications like pain and nausea.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And as you mentioned, CBD is just a major cannabinoid that most of us anyways know about, but there's hundreds of other cannabinoids that are currently being discovered, in real time. Do you feel like they're going to each be researched and developed, like each cannabinoid on its own? Or do you feel like there's going to be a kind of umbrella approach to the medical health and wellness aspects of these cannabinoids?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you hear things like, gee, it's the flavor of the month innovative product, and pick your minor cannabinoid that we're going to try to create a marketing campaign around. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that it's really creative innovation. Um, and then there's another camp that would say, gee, I kind of like it as nature intended, where there are two major and a number of minor cannabinoids, and that natural botanical soup really lends itself to the entourage effect that I think many of us believe strongly in, and it's really hard to say how all of those components of the plant work together to potentially sort of provide this entourage effect. So I think there's a lot of camps. I think there is opportunity to potentially isolate minor cannabinoids, do research to really demonstrate that, one, they're safe in isolation, and two, that they could have efficacy in whether it's wellness or treating disease. And so we're at the very beginning of what I think is a couple of decades of research where we're going to be doing exactly what you're describing. Learn more about the majors, learn a lot more about the minors, potentially learn more about the combination at different concentrations, really better understand the low L and the no L, which is the no observed adverse event level, that level below which we don't see anything. And so we're at the very beginning of really understanding a very bioactive plant that's been stigmatized and under prohibition for more than 80 years.
So speaking of understanding, I'm curious the work that you're doing for this nicotine cessation drug development and the patents that you're developing around it, and what you've come to understand and what the mission is to bring to market in that regard.
Yeah, so our the patent protected technology that we have, we had our patent issued on this technology in the US back in May of 2020, and the Japanese Patent Office we were approved for the Japanese market in December of 2020. And the technology combines synthetic nicotine with synthetic cannabidiol. This is not plant-based, but it's synthetic cannabidiol. And the indication that we're pursuing is smokeless tobacco use and addiction. And there's a real strategic reason why we pursued smokeless, and it had to do with patent protection and patent protectability. But the market just for smokeless tobacco addiction is in excess of 2 billion, and many people believe it's 4 billion. And there's currently not one single approved drug indicated to treat smokeless tobacco use and addiction. And so where we're at in the program is we've done all of the pharmacology and the toxicology studies, which are generally referred to as preclinical work. And we're now in the process of doing all the chemistry, the manufacturing, and the controls, which is analytical and stability work, with the clinical trial materials that we will be using to study in humans. And so we're in that process, and we're hopeful that we can commence a phase 1 clinical study later this year or early next year. And so that's where we're at. We're very excited. We believe it is a hugely undervalued asset of the company. We think it dovetails beautifully with our consumer side, because it allows us to really have the scientific chops to pivot from a pharmaceutical product to studying a consumer product or even a recreational product if we needed to do that, and apply the strengths of the company and our capabilities, really demonstrating that we know how to do things safely in a way that consumers can trust.
And was that always a part of the plan to have those two working in tandem there?
It's an interesting, we identified this asset back in 2016, and we always looked at what GW Pharmaceuticals was doing. It was just fascinating science and how they were being valued. And we thought we had a lot of strength in the science side of the world, and we felt like we could apply that strength as well as potentially improve the valuation of the company by also getting into the drug development side of this plant. And so that was really kind of the original thinking. And I think we'll get there. I think it's been it's been a challenge sometimes for analysts to analyze a consumer business and a biotech business at the same time. They generally have specialized analysts that cover each of those industries. And so that's been a little bit of a challenge, but I think there's ways for us to overcome that. And I'm confident that the science is going to prevail.
How do you feel like the way is to overcome it in terms of exposing to shareholders, to investors, to the investor community about what it is you're trying to accomplish?
I think there's a number of ways. I think potentially we could partner the drug development program, and all one has to do is go look at some of the companies that are either in the nicotine cessation space and the franchises that they have, and what an opportunity like this might mean to sort of evaluate that. So that's one option. I think it's been suggested that a spin out is an opportunity, and there's different ways to accomplish generating and creating value for our various operating divisions, whether it's the consumer side or the drug side.
And then how do you kind of, as CEO, how do you think about these things in terms of driving strategy? Is there a team of scientists and kind of the corporate governance part of things? Is it working together? Who's driving that strategy, and how do you kind of think about coalescing different moving parts of, as you said, a similar approach, a similar field, but slightly different?
Well, it starts with our board of directors. We have an extremely strong board of directors. We have 2 physicians that are on our board. So that not only helps with the consumer side, it helps significantly with the drug development side. One is a neurosurgeon, the other one is a cardiologist. Both of them have a lot of, not just clinical sort of experience, but also research experience. So it starts there. Then it really is something that the company embodies, in terms of just our focus and commitment to science. That's true on our consumer side. On the drug side, the scientists and the physicians that we use on that are generally outsourced. We have a team of drug development experts that we've worked with for several years. And I work very closely with them, and that's the model that we use to advance that program. And so it's really embodied in the company, though, as a whole, our commitment to science. We know, and as I mentioned, with the fish oil sort of history, we know the same thing is going to be necessary really to get consumer trust over time. They've got to understand and feel confident that there's enough science here to really add this to my wellness plan, or there's enough science here if I'm going to be, working with my physician and he's or she are very progressive, and they may suggest something that is neither an approved pharmaceutical product or is maybe a consumer product. It's something in between, and so. Those are things that science are going to answer over time. And I, as I mentioned, I think it's 1 to 2 decades before we really start to, better understand and more fully understand the plant.
Understanding it more as fish oil, less as snake oil, which I think is
right.
too many people are suffering from. Yeah, exactly.
You're absolutely right.
So talk to me a little bit about where you think, or how you think, the cannabis discussion right now in the States as it grows, as it evolves, do you feel like that's good for the CBD side of things, for the retail side of things? How do you see that influencing it?
So I think it's positive. I think anything really that helps to destigmatize cannabis, period, is good. And that is ongoing, and it is ongoing at the state level, and it is ongoing at the federal level. And as I mentioned earlier in the interview, 20 years ago we had one lane. It was illegal, illicit, and that's evolved to where we are now. So we've made a lot of progress, and now there are, and I don't know what the current count is, but a number of states where it is simply recreational, and so that tracks with perception and the attitude of the population generally. What was once thought to be generational is no longer. If you go into and any dispensary, either out of curiosity or as a consumer, it's very interesting to see the demographic range in there. It's from very young to plenty of people that are in their 70s, and so it's this, I think, is gaining wide acceptance. And I think that, it helps the CBD industry. It helps the cannabis industry generally. I think it helps drug development, where if we want to take it to the level where someone wants to invest enough into using a part of the plant or the whole plant as an approved drug, I think it helps that. So I just think it's all beneficial. I think there will be overlap between the various lanes, pharmaceutical, recreational, and consumer, over time, and that will continuously shift. But generally, I'm good with it. I think it's favorable to all parts of the cannabis industry and for all lanes.
And how do you see it shaking out in terms of, for investors? We've seen, a maturation in the cannabis industry broadly, on the THC side, on the CBD side, from some of the stronger players, and yet it's almost like that's being the opposite reflection in the share price. That it seems the better the top players are doing, the lower the share prices are going. Or there's certainly a lot of volatility in the past few months. I think people point to different reasons for that. How is that something that you think about? Is it something that you spend a lot of time thinking about, in terms of where the investor community is and where the share price is sitting?
Just valuation speak. You can go back a couple of years and look at some of the peaks that occurred in the category, and if you're a valuation person, you'd say, gee, at the time, those were frothy for sure, and really overvalued, and based on forecasts that were unrealistic and unsustainable. And yet a ton of money poured in, a ton of money from high net worths, from certainly institutional investors in Canada and other places, and many got hurt. And so I think that the sting from that has had a little bit of a hangover, and I think we're seeing a little bit of fatigue, and that combined with sort of FDA inaction, gridlock in Congress, what's going to happen with the filibuster, and those kind of things, all the uncertainty, as well as the fatigue, as well as they got stung, all those things in combination, I think have created the current environment. But these things evolve and they adjust over time, and I think that at some point there will be another wave. And as we move into, I kind of think of the next phase of the cannabis industry as being kind of a wellness phase. And if we kind of think of it that way, whether it's in the pharmaceutical space, the recreational space, and certainly there's a recreational component, but I think even in the recreational space and certainly in the consumer space, there is a huge wellness component. And so, I think there's a road ahead that I think is beneficial for operating companies, but really, to your question, for investors, that I think investors with a long view will benefit from. But I think we're in this period of time that's affected by those factors.
And how do you think about it as CEO in terms of approaching the investor community? What do you feel like is your point of emphasis in terms of, is it total addressable market? Is it, as you said, like consumers being developed more and more in terms of coming on board as consumers, new products being developed? What is it that you speak to in terms of your excitement about the industry at large?
So our strengths are clearly science and quality and trustworthiness. We believe we are the company to trust in the space because of our history of doing things right and backing it up by science. But we got to leverage that, and we got to take it to the sales channels with the right innovative products for the customers that are interested in those products. So it's really easy to speak to yourself and say, gee, I like these products, but you really have to focus on what consumers are looking for. And it has to be accessible to them, and it has to be at a price that is also sustainable for them. So all of those things really have to be considered when you're considering product development. And so our focus is really going to be to continue to do things responsibly. We know that that is a winning strategy in the long term. And so, we are thought of that way. That is how we want our brand to be, what we want it to be connected to. And we work very hard to do that. We look at every channel a little bit differently. We started in the natural product retail channel, and that is a very discerning channel. They really demand very clean ingredient decks, and most of them like natural and organic type of products. And so that is a completely different customer than, say, the FDM channel, or even if you think of the broader DTC channel. And so it's really important to have the right products for the right channel for the customer that is in that channel. And so that is really our strength, backed up by a company that everybody can trust. They know that the products are the highest quality, they're safe, and they're backed by science. And so that's really who we are and what we stand for. Retailers really like that, especially when they're in this space with a lot of bad actors. And we believe our customers also believe that's important. And we think, as I mentioned, that's a winning strategy over time.
I'm curious, what's your main driving either vision or kind of ethos as CEO? And do you feel like it's anything changes when you're the CEO of a cannabis company?
It does change, but it's evolving. Where it was maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago is a little bit more fringe, maybe. Today, and I think going forward, cannabis is simply a consumer product. It's part of the CPG industry. If you go back to alcohol prohibition, alcohol was a fringe product. It's become mainstream product. It is a consumer product. It is covered by Wall Street. It is banked by, on and on and on. And I think the same thing is going to happen to cannabis, to CBD, however you want to think of it, as a consumer product. And it will be part of that. And so we're at the, so in terms of my vision, I see it that way. Because I see it that way, I know eventually bigger players will get into the space, and we talk to them and we know them. We know what's important to them, and they do things properly. They do things that are backed by science. They do things that, don't look anything like what the bad actors are doing. They don't make claims that they cannot substantiate, on and on. And so we're mimicking what they do because we think that's the right way to succeed in the long run. And so if there's a vision, it's really that. Along the way, you have to make sure that you're getting the enough customers to buy your products and to support the company to get there. And that is also a big focus, and those go hand in hand. We think of 2021 as being kind of a repositioning year as we're coming out of the pandemic, as we're contracting and some of the bad actors are falling by the wayside. and as maybe there's a little bit of regulatory clarity. And so all of those things, from my perspective, really situate 2021 as kind of a repositioning year, and 2022 getting back closer to pre-pandemic consumer spending levels, like 2019. And so I think that really, just from a macroeconomic level, are real positive for companies like CV Sciences, and that we will get back to the levels that we were at before. And I think the valuations will improve, and I think there's opportunities for investors as a result.
Yeah, I think it's exciting to think about the opportunities as the world opens up, as people start kind of opening themselves up to a new, different reality than the one we've faced for the past year. Great catching up with you, Joe. I hope this is the first conversation of many. I really appreciate you taking the time and talking to us about CV Sciences and the broader sector. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you, Rena. Anytime.